The funeral had ended only 3 days earlier. I was still sitting on the couch in my father's old countryside house, surrounded by empty tissue boxes and cups of cold tea, when the doorbell rang. I considered pretending I didn't hear it. I had no strength left for sympathy visits. No patience for neighbors offering awkward hugs, people who barely knew my father but suddenly felt entitled to my grief. The doorbell rang again. Sharp. Professional. Unwilling to be ignored. With legs that felt impossibly heavy, I forced myself up and opened the door. And froze. The man standing on my porch didn't belong in this village. His charcoal gray suit looked like it cost more than my car. His black hair was perfectly styled, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Dark eyes scanned me with a calm intensity that immediately made my skin prickle. He held a leather briefcase in one hand. "Emily Carter," he said. His voice was deep, controlled, and completely devoid of warmth. "I assume." "Yes." I tightened my grip on the doorknob, as if it could anchor me. "My name is Adrian Hale," he continued. "I was your father's attorney. May we speak privately?" I stepped aside without answering. Inside, the house still looked like grief. Sympathy cards covered every surface. Old photographs stared back at me from the walls. The air smelled faintly of flowers and dust. Adrian took everything in with one slow glance, then sat in the armchair my father used to occupy. Seeing a stranger sitting there made my throat tighten. "Your father retained my services 6 months ago," Adrian said, opening his briefcase. "He asked me to handle legal matters related to his estate." 6 months? My chest burned. "He knew he was ill," Adrian continued, pulling out documents. "Terminal cancer." The words knocked the air out of me. "That's impossible," I whispered. "They said it was a heart attack." "He didn't want you to know," Adrian said calmly. "He believed it would spare you prolonged pain." For 6 months. For 6 months, my father had known he was dying and said nothing. "He protected you," Adrian corrected when I spoke the thought aloud. "Even in his will." He slid the documents across the coffee table. "The house is yours. His private book collection, valued at approximately $2 million, is yours. There are also investments that will provide you with a stable monthly income for the rest of your life." I should have felt relief. Instead, all I felt was emptiness. "There is, however, one condition." Something in his tone shifted. "What condition?" I asked, already afraid of the answer. "To receive the inheritance," Adrian said evenly, "you must marry me within 30 days of your father's death." The room tilted. "I'm sorry, what?" "If you refuse," he continued, "the estate will be donated entirely to charity." "That's not legal," I snapped. "You can't force someone to marry." "I'm not forcing you," he replied. "You have a choice." It didn't feel like one. "Why would my father do this?" My voice shook. "And why would you agree?" For the first time, something flickered across Adrian's face. "Too fast to read, I had my reasons," he said. "And your father had his." He pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it in front of me. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. "For Emily." "Read this before you decide," Adrian said. With trembling hands, I opened the letter. "My dearest Emily. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to say goodbye properly. Big emotions were never my strength. Adrian Hale is a good man. Better than he seems. I know what I'm asking feels cruel and unreasonable, but please trust me, this is the last thing I will ever ask of you. You are not safe right now. There are people who want what I left behind. People who would not hesitate to hurt you. Adrian can protect you. He promised me he would. This marriage doesn't have to be forever. Only long enough for the danger to pass. I love you more than words can express. And I'm sorry for this final burden, Dad." I read it 3 times before I could breathe again. What danger? I asked. What was he involved in? Your father had enemies, Adrian said simply. Now that he's gone, they'll come for what he left you. So this is protection, I said bitterly. You're a bodyguard with a marriage license. Something like that. He stood. You have 24 hours, he said. Marry me, receive the inheritance, and remain protected. Refuse, and you'll be alone. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I don't want this any more than you do. But I keep my promises. The door closed behind him. I stood there alone, holding my father's letter, staring at an impossible choice. Marry a complete stranger? Or lose everything my father left behind? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my father's handwriting appeared in my mind, steady, familiar, final. You are not safe right now. By morning, the decision no longer felt like a decision. It felt like a countdown. At exactly 9 a.m., a black sedan pulled up in front of the house. I was already waiting outside. Adrian stepped out of the car, just as sharply dressed as the day before, as if time and emotion simply didn't affect him. When he saw my overnight bag at my feet, something subtle shifted in his gaze. You've decided, he said. Yes. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. But I want rules. He nodded once. Of course. The courthouse was quiet. Too quiet for something that would alter my entire life. We didn't hold hands. We didn't smile. We stood side by side like two strangers waiting for a train, listening to the clerk recite vows that felt oddly hollow without love behind them. When she asked if I took Adrian Hale as my lawful husband, my throat tightened. I do, I said. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I signed my name. Each letter looked unfamiliar, as if I were already becoming someone else. Just like that, it was done. Outside, the cold winter air hit my face, and I realized my hands were shaking. You okay? Adrian asked quietly. I just married a man I met 48 hours ago, I replied. How do you think I am? A corner of his mouth lifted, not a smile, exactly. More like acknowledgement. Let's talk boundaries, he said as the driver opened the car door. Inside the vehicle, he handed me a thin folder. Everything is temporary, Adrian began. The marriage, the arrangement, all of it. We present ourselves as a united couple in public. In private, we live separately. Separate bedrooms, I said immediately. Agreed. No physical contact unless absolutely necessary. Agreed. No controlling my schedule, I added. I'm not your possession. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. You're not, he said. And you never will be. Something about the way he said it eased the knot in my chest, just a little. You'll be staying at my penthouse, he continued. It's secure. Private security, monitored access, no media leaks. I don't want to disappear, I said. My life doesn't end because of this marriage. It won't, he said. But some things will change. They already had. The elevator ride to his apartment felt endless. When the doors opened, I stepped into a space that looked more like a luxury hotel than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Dark marble floors. City lights stretching endlessly below. This is where you live? I asked. For now. A staff member greeted us, her eyes flicking briefly to my hand, now wearing a simple ring Adrian had handed me minutes earlier. Mrs. Hale, she said politely. The title hit harder than the vows. I forced a nod. That night, I stood alone in the guest bedroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Same face. Same eyes, but nothing else felt familiar. I was wealthy now. Married. Protected. And yet, I had never felt more uncertain. Somewhere beyond the walls of that penthouse, my father's enemies were watching. And somewhere within those same walls, I was living with a man whose calm control hid far more than he ever revealed. I didn't know it yet. But this marriage was about to cost me much more than my freedom. The first headline appeared less than a week after the wedding. I found it while scrolling through my phone in the penthouse kitchen, still in my pajamas, coffee untouched beside me, rising attorney Adrian Hale secretly marries mystery woman. My stomach dropped. There it is, I muttered. Adrian stood across from me, adjusting his cufflinks, already dressed for work. He glanced at the screen without reacting. I expected it sooner, he said calmly. There's a photo, I added. Blurry, but it's definitely us. That will be the last unclear one, he replied. From now on, we control the narrative. Control. The word followed me all day. By evening, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating, unknown numbers, distant relatives suddenly reappearing, reporters leaving cheerful voicemails pretending they weren't hunting for a scandal. You don't have to answer, Adrian said when he found me sitting on the couch, phone face down. I know, I replied. But I hate feeling like I'm hiding. You're not hiding, he said. You're adjusting. That night, he told me about the gala. A charity event, he explained. High profile. Press will be there. We attend together. My heart skipped. Already? It's better to be seen than speculated about, he said. They'll tear you apart if you stay invisible. I wanted to argue. Instead, I nodded. The gala was held in a restored historic hotel downtown, all crystal chandeliers and marble staircases. Cameras flashed the moment we stepped inside. Adrian placed his hand lightly on my back. The touch was brief. Professional. Necessary. Still, my body reacted before my mind could stop it. I lifted my chin and smiled. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet curiosity. Eyes followed us. Conversations paused. I could almost hear people rewriting my story in their heads. Who is she? Where did she come from? How did she land him? A woman in a silver gown approached us, her smile sharp and practiced. Adrian, she said, air-kissing his cheek before turning to me. And you must be the surprise. Emily, I said, extending my hand. His wife. The word felt dangerous. Powerful. Her gaze lingered a second too long. Calculating. How unexpected, she said. Adrian's hand returned to my back, firmer this time. My wife prefers privacy, he said coolly. But I'm sure she'll grow used to the attention. Later, when I stood alone near the balcony doors, the city glowing behind the glass, Adrian joined me. You did well, he said quietly. I felt like an exhibit, I replied. You were flawless, he corrected. I turned to him. Do you always talk about people like their performances? Something dark flickered in his eyes. Only when the stakes are high. That was the first time I realized. This wasn't just about protecting me. This marriage was also a shield for him, and whatever secrets Adrian Hale was hiding, the world had just been invited to watch us unravel them together. After the gala, things changed. Not in any obvious way. Adrian still followed the rules we'd set, still respected my space, still treated the marriage like a carefully managed agreement, but the air between us felt heavier. The next morning, I found a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. Out early. Meetings all day. Security will stay with you. I stared at the signature longer than I should have. Security. Two men I didn't recognize now waited outside the apartment whenever I left. They were polite, distant, and impossible to ignore. I was protected. I was also being watched. That afternoon, a black SUV followed us for 3 blocks before disappearing into traffic. The driver noticed. So did I. Is that normal? I asked. No, he said. But it's handled. That night, I overheard Adrian on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I was walking past his office when his voice cut through the quiet. She can't know yet, he said. Not until I'm sure. My steps slowed. You promised discretion, he continued, his tone cold now. If you move before I give the word, I will shut this down permanently. Silence then, softer, but more dangerous. I won't lose control again. Again. I returned to my room, heart racing. What had he lost control of before? The next crack came from an unexpected place. I was invited to a private lunch, no press, no cameras, by a woman named Victoria Cross. She had been at the gala. The one in silver, her office overlooked the river, minimalist and immaculate. You married well, she said lightly as we Saturday. Adrian is selective. I didn't marry for strategy, I replied. Her smile sharpened. Of course not, she said. That's what makes you useful. I stiffened. You should understand something, Victoria continued, swirling her wine. Adrian doesn't do anything without reason. People around him are assets. Or liabilities. And which am I? I asked. She leaned in slightly. That depends on how long you last. The words followed me home like a threat that night. I confronted Adrian. Who is Victoria Cross? I asked. His jaw tightened. Someone who enjoys testing limits. Why is she interested in me? She isn't, he said. She's interested in leverage. I crossed my arms. And am I leverage? Silence stretched between us. You're protected, he finally said. That's what matters. That's not an answer. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You don't want the full truth yet. And why not? Because once you know it, he said, there's no going back. For the first time since this marriage began, fear crept in, not of the outside world, but of the man standing in front of me. I realized then. This marriage wasn't just built on lies. It was built on secrets powerful enough to destroy us both. I stopped waiting for answers. If Adrian wasn't going to tell me the truth, I would find it myself. It started small. Late nights when he came home exhausted but alert, as if sleep were a luxury he couldn't afford. Phone calls he took on the balcony, voice lowered, gaze fixed on the city like he was bracing for impact. Names I overheard more than once, people who weren't clients, weren't friends. One evening, after he'd fallen asleep in his office chair, I noticed the light under the door. I told myself I was only checking if he needed anything. That was the lie I used to cross the line. His laptop was still open. I hesitated. Just for a second, then I touched the trackpad. Files filled the screen, legal records, financial transfers, encrypted messages. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scrolled. One name appeared again and again. My father's. My chest tightened. I opened the most recent document. It wasn't a will. It wasn't an investment. It was a legal dispute, an unfinished one. A case my father had been involved in shortly before his death. And Adrian Hale was listed as the opposing counsel. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the words. Adrian hadn't just represented my father. He had been fighting him. The door creaked behind me. I turned too fast, knocking the chair back. Adrian stood there, eyes sharp, face unreadable. How long have you known? He asked quietly. About what? I shot back. That you were suing my father? That you stood on the opposite side while he was dying? It wasn't personal, he said. I laughed, once, bitter and hollow. You don't get to decide that. The silence between us felt dangerous now. He asked me to protect you, Adrian said finally. That doesn't erase everything that came before. So this marriage, my voice cracked. Was it strategy? Guilt? Or just convenience? His jaw clenched. I didn't plan to fall into this, he said. And I didn't plan for you to get hurt. But you knew, I said. You knew more than you ever told me. Yes. The word landed like a slap. I stepped back, shaking. I trusted you, I whispered. You trusted the version of me I let you see. That hurt more than the truth itself. I grabbed my coat and keys. Where are you going? He asked. Somewhere I can breathe, I said. Somewhere I don't have to wonder which parts of my life are real. He didn't stop me. As the elevator doors closed, I realized something terrifying. The man who promised to protect me might also be the reason I was never safe at all. The city felt different without Adrian's shadow behind me, too loud. Too open. Too exposed. I checked into a small boutique hotel across town under my maiden name. No security. No black cars waiting outside. Just a quiet room and the illusion of freedom. That illusion lasted less than 12 hours. It started with a message, "We know where you are." No number. No name. I stared at my phone, my pulse hammering. I told myself it was coincidence. A cruel prank. Anything but the truth my father had warned me about. Then the second message came. Your father didn't die by accident. My hands went cold. I didn't reply. I didn't move. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to every sound in the hallway, every elevator ding, every passing footstep. By evening, someone knocked on my door. Not a hotel employee. I saw the shadow first, wrong shape, wrong stance. I grabbed my bag and slipped into the bathroom, locking the door just as the handle rattled. My phone rang. Adrian. I almost didn't answer. Where are you? He demanded the second I picked up. How did you find me? I whispered. You were never invisible, he said. That's the problem. The knocking stopped. Listen to me, Adrian said, voice tight now. They followed you the moment you left. I told you not to go alone. You lied to me, I snapped. And I still protected you, he shot back. Open the window. Do not leave the room. Sirens wailed in the distance. Moments later, heavy footsteps echoed outside, followed by shouting, authoritative, controlled. The danger receded as quickly as it had arrived. An hour later, Adrian stood in my hotel room, jacket wrinkled, knuckles bruised. I had never seen him like that. You put yourself in their line of sight, he said, running a hand through his hair. Do you have any idea how close that was? They said my father didn't die by accident, I whispered. His expression changed instantly. Who contacted you? I showed him the messages. He exhaled slowly. Then it started. What started? I demanded. He met my gaze, and for the first time since we met, there was no calculation in his eyes, only urgency. The war your father tried to keep you out of. The room felt too small. You can hate me later, Adrian said. But right now, you come back with me. Or you won't make it through the week. I hesitated only a second. Then I nodded. Because whatever secrets Adrian Hale was hiding, they were now the only thing standing between me and the truth about my father's death. We didn't go back to the penthouse. Adrian took me to a secure residence outside the city, no signage, no visible neighbors, security woven so seamlessly into the landscape that it felt unreal. This is where the truth lives, he said as the gate closed behind us. Inside, the house was colder than the penthouse. Less polished. More real. He poured 2 glasses of water, then leaned against the counter, staring at the floor. My firm isn't just a law firm, he began. It's a firewall. For what? I asked. For people who know too much, he said. And for people who are willing to destroy everything to bury the truth. My chest tightened. Your father wasn't a victim, Adrian continued. He was a threat. The words landed heavily. He uncovered financial crimes tied to a network of powerful individuals, politicians, executives, even judges. He came to me because I was already fighting them. Fighting them how? I whispered. In court. in settlements. And sometimes, he hesitated, by forcing them into the light before they could strike first. You sued him, I said. I saw the case. Yes, Adrian admitted. It was a cover. A controlled conflict so he wouldn't look like a whistleblower. I closed my eyes. So my father was pretending to be your enemy, I said. And I married you to stay alive. You married me, he said quietly, because your father knew they wouldn't touch you if you belonged to me. I laughed bitterly. So I became a warning label. Yes. The honesty hurt more than any lie. Did you love him? I asked suddenly. Adrian looked up, surprised. I respected him, he said. Enough to promise I'd keep you breathing. Silence filled the room. And my feelings? I asked. Were those collateral damage too? His gaze softened, but he didn't reach for me. That's where I failed, he said. I didn't expect you to matter to me. The admission stole my breath. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Adrian continued. Only to stay long enough to finish what your father started. And then what? I asked. Then you walk away, he said. Free. Untouched by this world. I stared at him, really seeing him for the first time, not as a protector or a manipulator, but as a man standing at the center of a storm he couldn't step out of. I realized then. The real danger wasn't Adrian's secrets. It was how deeply I was already tied to them. I didn't sleep that night. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every thought echo louder than it should. I lay awake replaying Adrian's words, my father's letter, the messages on my phone. You belong to me. That was what had kept me alive. By morning, I was done being someone else's shield. I want access, I said over breakfast. Adrian looked up sharply. Access to what? To everything, I replied. The files. The cases. The people my father was investigating. That's not what he wanted for you. He wanted me alive, I said. He didn't say I had to be ignorant. Adrian studied me for a long moment, as if weighing a risk he'd sworn never to take. Finally, he nodded once. Then you don't get partial truths anymore. He led me into a secure room in the basement. No windows, reinforced walls, servers humming softly along one side. These are your father's findings, Adrian said, pulling up a digital archive. Accounts, shell companies, falsified charities. Victoria Cross is connected to all of them. My jaw tightened, so that lunch wasn't curiosity, I said. It was a warning. Yes, Adrian replied. And an invitation. She wanted to see how controllable you were. I scrolled through the files, recognizing names from headlines, boardrooms, charity galas. Power disguised as generosity. Crimes hidden behind influence, they won't stop, I said quietly. No, Adrian agreed. They'll escalate. I straightened. Then we give them what they don't expect. His eyes narrowed. Which is? Me, I said. Silence fell between us. You said marrying you made me untouchable, I continued. So let them see me. Let them underestimate me. That puts a target on your back. There's already one there, I replied. At least this way, I'm choosing where to stand. That afternoon, we leaked a single piece of information, harmless on its own, devastating to anyone who knew the full picture. By nightfall, the trap snapped shut. Victoria called. You're braver than I thought, she said smoothly. Or reckless. Funny, I replied. I was thinking the same about you. Her laugh was cold. This isn't a game you understand yet. I don't need to, I said. I just need you to make one mistake. The line went dead. Adrian stared at me, something like awe in his expression. You realize, he said slowly, there's no pretending anymore. I know, I answered. For the first time since this marriage began, I felt something other than fear. I felt ready. Because if they wanted a war, they were going to learn I wasn't the weakest piece on the board. The collapse didn't come loudly. There were no sirens. No dramatic arrests on live television. It happened quietly, through frozen accounts, sealed indictments, and sudden resignations announced in carefully worded press releases, the kind of downfall that only terrifies people who understand power. Victoria Cross disappeared first. Her foundation shut down overnight. Her name vanished from boards, events, headlines. When I searched for her, all that remained were legal filings and silence. Then came the confirmation Adrian had been waiting for. My father hadn't died of a heart attack. He had been poisoned, slowly, deliberately, through medication altered just enough to evade early detection. The same network he exposed had tried to erase him quietly. They failed. Because he had left a trail. And because he had left me. The case files my father built, the ones Adrian protected, detonated at precisely the right moment. Deals collapsed. Alliances turned inward. People started talking to save themselves, and no one came for me again. The war was over. A week later, I stood alone at my father's grave. I didn't stay safe the way you wanted, I said softly. But I stayed standing. The wind carried my words away. That night, Adrian and I sat across from each other in the penthouse, the city glowing quietly below. It's done, he said. You can leave tomorrow if you want. I studied him, the man who had lied to me, protected me, and nearly destroyed me all at once. Was any of it real? I asked. Yes, he answered immediately. More than I planned for. Silence stretched between us. I reached for my wedding ring, turning it slowly. This marriage started as armor, I said. I won't let it become a cage. I wouldn't ask you to, he said. I slipped the ring off and placed it on the table between us. I choose myself, I said. Everything else has to come after that. He nodded, pain flickering across his face, but no resistance. That was how I knew he meant it. Months later, my life looked nothing like it had before. I rebuilt my father's legacy, not as a shield, but as a light. I took control of my inheritance, my name, my future. And Adrian? He remained part of my story. Not as my husband. Not as my protector. But as a man who learned, too late, that the strongest women don't need saving, they need the truth. And the freedom to choose what comes next. This wasn't the ending my father planned. But it was the one I earned.